The Thanksgiving dinner was meant to be a rare moment of normalcy, a pause from years of grief, exhaustion, and quiet survival. The apartment in Pittsburgh felt unusually full that evening, warmed by the smell of roasted turkey, stuffing, and baked pumpkin pie. Plates clinked softly, and polite conversation floated across the table. But beneath every exchanged smile lay tension that no one dared to name. It was the kind of gathering where everyone showed up carrying unspoken truths, hoping the noise of tradition would keep those truths buried for just one more day. For me, the meal was another reminder of how much I had been carrying alone. I spoke casually about my double shifts, joking lightly about waiting tables until midnight and delivering packages before sunrise. My words were meant to sound harmless, but they came from a place of deep fatigue. Every sentence was built on sacrifice. I worked relentlessly to make sure the rent was paid in full each month, believing that stability was the only thing holding my fractured family together. Losing this apartment felt unthinkable after already losing my parents. Paying $1,200 on time had become my silent promise to survival. Then everything stopped. My grandmother, seated a few places away, froze with her fork suspended midair. The room seemed to narrow as her eyes focused on me with sudden clarity. Her voice, calm but firm, cut through the hum of conversation with a single question that felt almost out of place in such a familiar setting. She asked why I was paying rent for an apartment that belonged to me. The words landed heavily, as if the air itself had thickened around them. Time slowed. My heart pounded so loudly, it drowned out every other sound. Confusion flooded my mind. The question made no sense, and yet it carried a certainty that unsettled me deeply. I felt my fingers go numb as my fork slipped onto the plate. I asked her what she meant, but even as I spoke, I sensed something irreversible had already shifted. Across the table, my sister went silent, her face drained of color, her posture stiffening as though she had been caught in a spotlight she never expected to face. The warmth of the meal evaporated, replaced by a silence so heavy it pressed against my chest. In that moment, years of routine suddenly felt fragile. Every wire transfer, every missed meal, every exhausted morning blurred together under the weight of that single question. The life I thought I understood no longer aligned with the reality forming in front of me. My grandmother's steady gaze didn't waver. She wasn't confused. She wasn't speculating. She knew something I didn't, and that realization was terrifying. The table, once a symbol of togetherness, became the stage for an unspoken reckoning. No one rushed to explain. No one laughed it off. The truth hung there, raw and exposed, waiting to be acknowledged. I could feel the years of trust I had placed in my sister trembling, cracking under the pressure of that silence. The idea that I might have been wrong about something so fundamental shook me to my core. That question did more than interrupt a holiday meal. It split my understanding of family, loyalty, and sacrifice wide open. It revealed that while I had been fighting exhaustion and grief, someone else had been quietly controlling the narrative of my life. The dinner continued on the surface, but internally, everything had already changed. The lie had been exposed, not through accusation or anger, but through one simple question asked at exactly the right moment. Working 2 jobs became my way of surviving without complaint, a routine I accepted as necessary rather than extraordinary. Each day blurred into the next as I learned how to measure time in shifts instead of hours. Nights was spent on my feet in a crowded restaurant, weaving between tables, memorizing orders, forcing polite smiles even when my legs ached and my head throbbed from exhaustion. By the time midnight arrived and the last customer left, I barely had enough energy to count my tips before collapsing into a few hours of restless sleep. Mornings came too quickly. Before the city fully woke up, I was already back on the road, delivering packages and food, orders through quiet streets still damp from night air. Coffee became less of a comfort and more of a necessity to keep my eyes open. I told myself this pace was temporary, that pushing through now would protect the one thing I could not afford to lose. Stability. Every delivery, every late-night shift, carried the same purpose. The rent had to be paid, no matter what it cost me physically or emotionally. Trust made that sacrifice feel justified. I believed I was doing the right thing for my family, especially for my sister. After losing our parents, I convinced myself that shared grief meant shared responsibility, even if it wasn't evenly balanced. When she told me she was struggling financially, I didn't question it. I assumed she was doing her best, just as I was. Covering the full rent felt like an act of loyalty, a way to hold what little family we had left together. Over time, the payments became automatic. On the first of every month, I transferred the full amount without hesitation. Even when my bank balance dropped dangerously low, I skipped small comforts without thinking twice, choosing cheaper meals, worn-out clothes, and rare moments of rest. I learned how to stretch each dollar, how to ignore the constant fatigue settling into my bones. I told myself that resilience was something to be proud of. That endurance meant strength. Meanwhile, signs I should have questioned stayed quietly in the background. My sister's life didn't reflect the same urgency or sacrifice. New clothes appeared regularly, shopping bags left by the door, deliveries arriving with her name on the labels. She went out often, posting photos of dinners and outings that felt far removed from my daily reality. When I noticed, I pushed the discomfort aside. Grief can look different, I told myself. People cope in their own ways. Whenever I tried to understand more about our living arrangement, the conversation was redirected. Questions about the landlord or paperwork were brushed off casually, dismissed as unnecessary stress. Her reassurances was smooth, paired with compliments about my strength and reliability. She framed my efforts as natural, even expected, praising my ability to handle pressure instead of acknowledging the imbalance. Those words kept me quiet. They made me believe that questioning anything would make me seem ungrateful or selfish. Trust can be dangerous when it replaces clarity. I trusted not because the situation made sense, but because I needed to believe someone had my best interests at heart. Working 2 jobs left little time to think deeply or challenge what I was told. Exhaustion narrows perspective, and survival becomes the only focus. I kept moving, kept paying, kept believing that fairness would eventually return on its own. Looking back, the hardest part was not the long hours or physical strain, but the realization that my trust was misplaced. Every shift I worked, every payment I made, was built on an assumption that turned out to be false. I was carrying a burden that never should have been mine, sustained by loyalty to the wrong person. That truth reshaped how I understood sacrifice, teaching me that trust without transparency can quietly drain everything you have to give. The truth about the inheritance did not arrive loudly or dramatically. It emerged quietly, almost gently, yet its impact was powerful enough to rewrite years of my life in an instant. For a long time, I believed my struggle was simply the result of bad timing, grief, and the harsh reality of adulthood arriving all at once. I never imagined that, beneath my exhaustion and constant effort, lay a hidden truth deliberately kept from me, shaping my circumstances without my knowledge or consent. After my parents' deaths, everything felt unstable. I was grieving, unemployed, and desperate for something solid to hold on to. In that vulnerable state, I trusted the people closest to me to guide me through decisions I didn't have the strength to question. Legal documents, finances, and long-term planning felt overwhelming. So I stepped back and let others take the lead. That choice seemed reasonable at the time, rooted in trust rather than negligence. I believed that anything important would be shared with me honestly. What I did not know was that my parents had planned carefully for my future long before tragedy struck. They had created a trust, structured with intention and foresight, to protect my stability no matter what happened to them. Within that trust was the apartment I had been living in all along, designated specifically for me. It was meant to be a foundation, a safeguard during uncertain times, not a burden I would spend years struggling to afford. That inheritance existed quietly in the background while my life moved forward under false assumptions. I paid rent month after month for a property that was already mine, unaware that the security I was working so hard to maintain had been legally secured from the beginning. The knowledge that this information was withheld on purpose made the realization even heavier. It wasn't an oversight or misunderstanding. It was a choice. Years passed as the truth stayed hidden. During that time, I structured my entire life around survival. I worked relentlessly, believing I had no alternative. Every decision I made was influenced by the need to keep up with payments, to remain dependable, to avoid collapse. Meanwhile, the inheritance meant to support me was being controlled by someone else, used in ways never intended by my parents. The secrecy changed the meaning of my sacrifices. What I once viewed as necessary endurance became evidence of manipulation. The trust my parents built was not just financial, it was emotional, rooted in the belief that family would act in good faith. That trust was broken quietly, without confrontation, leaving me to carry consequences that were never meant to be mine. Learning the truth reshaped my understanding of the past. Moments that once seemed confusing suddenly made sense. The evasive answers, the reluctance to discuss paperwork, the insistence that I didn't need to know details, yet all of it formed a pattern I hadn't recognized before. The inheritance wasn't just hidden. It was actively kept out of reach. The most painful realization was not the financial loss, but the years spent doubting myself. I believed my exhaustion was a personal failure rather than the result of being deprived of what was rightfully mine. Knowing that my parents had tried to protect me all along brought both comfort and grief. Comfort in their foresight, and grief for the years I lived without the security they intended to provide. A hidden inheritance is more than concealed paperwork. It is time taken, peace withheld, and trust quietly eroded. When the truth finally surfaced, it exposed not only the secret itself, but the cost of keeping it buried for so long. The balcony felt strangely distant from the rest of the apartment that night. As if stepping through the sliding door meant leaving behind the version of life I thought I understood. The city lights of Pittsburgh flickered below, muted by the cold evening air, while the muffled sounds of dishes being cleared drifted from inside. What should have been a quiet moment after a long day carried an unexpected weight. When I sensed before a single word was spoken, my grandmother's expression alone made it clear that this conversation would not be ordinary. She closed the door behind us gently, not to be secretive, but deliberate. The small space felt intimate and serious, removed from the warmth and noise of the Thanksgiving gathering. We sat facing each other, the night air sharp against my skin, my mind still replaying the question she had asked at the dinner table. My heart hadn't slowed since then. I knew something important was coming, yet I wasn't prepared for how deeply it would reach. She began by asking about the rent payments she had noticed earlier, her voice steady and calm. There was no accusation, only concern. I explained my routine without hesitation, describing how I transferred the full amount every month, how it had become second nature over the years. As I spoke, I heard the exhaustion in my own voice, the quiet acceptance of a burden I had never questioned aloud. She listened closely, her eyes never leaving mine, absorbing every detail. When I finished, the silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. My grandmother reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, worn at the edges from time and careful handling. She placed it between us, opening it slowly, as if giving the truth space to breathe. Inside were documents I had never seen before, pages that carried my parents' intentions in black and white. She explained that they had planned for my future, setting aside the apartment as part of a trust meant to protect me. The realization hit in waves. The place I had been fighting to afford, the source of so much stress and exhaustion, had always belonged to me. The air seemed to thin as the meaning of her words settled in. My thoughts raced, struggling to reconcile years of sacrifice with this newly revealed reality. I felt anger, confusion, and grief all at once, emotions colliding without order. My grandmother spoke gently but firmly, explaining how the paperwork had been withheld, how control had been taken without transparency. There was sadness in her voice, not only for what had happened, but for the trust that had been violated. She reminded me that my parents' wishes were clear and that their intention had never been for me to struggle in silence. Hearing that brought an unexpected ache, a reminder of how deeply they had tried to care for me, even in their absence. That balcony conversation marked a turning point. The uncertainty that had shaped my life cracked open, replaced by clarity that was both painful and empowering. For the first time, I understood that my struggle was not inevitable, and that I had the right to question what had been done in my name. My grandmother's presence grounded me, her certainty offering stability in the middle of emotional chaos. When we stood to go back inside, nothing outward had changed, yet everything inside me had. The city lights looked the same, the apartment just as familiar, but my perspective had shifted completely. That quiet exchange on the balcony became the moment where ignorance ended and truth took its place, setting in motion a future no longer built on silence or sacrifice without choice. The confrontation did not begin with shouting, but with tension so thick it filled every corner of the room. When we stepped back inside from the balcony, the air in the apartment felt different, charged with unspoken awareness. My sister stood waiting, her posture rigid, her eyes darting between my grandmother and me. She knew something had shifted, even before a single word was exchanged. The silence stretched, pressing against all of us, until it finally broke. She spoke first, offering explanations that sounded hurried and rehearsed. She claimed she had only been managing things on my behalf, insisting I hadn't been ready to handle complicated matters after losing our parents. Her words tried to soften the truth, framing deception as protection, but the cracks showed immediately. Each sentence revealed more defensiveness than care, more justification than remorse. What she called management, my grandmother recognized as control. The discussion escalated as questions replaced assumptions. Documents were mentioned, timelines were questioned. My sister's tone shifted, growing sharper as her story lost cohesion. She admitted to keeping information from me, yet tried to shift responsibility, suggesting I should have asked more questions or investigated on my own. Hearing that stung deeply. Trust had been turned against me, used as evidence of my own fault. For the first time, I found my voice. Years of exhaustion and quiet resentment surfaced. No longer contained, I spoke about the endless shifts, the physical strain, and the emotional toll of carrying financial responsibility alone. I described how every payment I made was driven by fear of losing stability, not by choice. Saying it aloud made the reality undeniable. The imbalance was no longer theoretical. It was lived experience. My grandmother anchored the conversation in facts rather than emotion. She made it clear that the legal truth mattered more than excuses. The trust documents outlined my parents' intent with precision, leaving no room for interpretation. The apartment was never meant to be a shared asset under secret control. It was mine, designated for my security and future. The authority of the paperwork stripped away the remaining defenses, grounding the confrontation in reality. Once liars became involved, the chaos narrowed into a process. Emails, phone calls, and formal notices replaced emotional arguments. The law moved steadily, indifferent to personal justifications. Ownership was confirmed, corrections were initiated, and boundaries were enforced through official channels. What felt overwhelming at first became empowering as each step restored clarity and balance. Receiving the keys in my own name marked a moment of quiet victory. There was no celebration, only a deep sense of relief. Changing the locks symbolized more than physical security. It represented the end of manipulation and the beginning of autonomy. The space transformed from a source of stress into a place of control and safety. Reclaiming what was mine was not about revenge or punishment. It was about restoring truth after years of distortion. The legal resolution validated my experience, proving that endurance had masked injustice. Standing in the apartment afterward, alone and unburdened, I felt something new take shape, confidence rooted in clarity. The confrontation had been painful, but it led to the undeniable truth, and with it, the freedom to move forward on my own terms. Cutting ties was not an impulsive decision or an act driven by anger. It came after the truth had settled, after the legal dust cleared, and after I finally allowed myself to acknowledge how deeply the betrayal had affected me. Once the apartment was legally mine and the constant pressure of survival lifted, a different weight surfaced: the emotional toll of maintaining a connection that had cost me years of peace. I realized that moving forward required more than reclaiming property. It required reclaiming myself. The silence that followed my sister's departure was unsettling at first. The apartment felt unfamiliar without her presence. Even though it was calmer, I noticed how quiet mornings became, how the tension I once carried unconsciously had begun to fade. There were no sudden interruptions, no unspoken expectations, no fear of another demand disguised as family obligation. That quiet created space for reflection, and in that space, I understood how necessary distance truly was. Setting boundaries meant accepting that family does not automatically earn access to your life, especially when trust has been repeatedly violated. Blocking phone numbers and cutting off digital connections felt drastic in theory, but in practice, it was protective. Each blocked channel removed another path for manipulation, guilt, or emotional disruption. The absence of contact was not emptiness. It was relief. For the first time in years, my thoughts were my own, uninterrupted and unburdened. As days turned into weeks, the apartment began to change along with me. Rearranging furniture, adding small details like plants and softer lighting, became acts of ownership and healing. These choices were not about decoration, but about agency. Every adjustment reflected a decision made without compromise, without fear of someone else's reaction. The space slowly transformed into a reflection of who I was becoming: calmer, more confident, and grounded. Peace also came through reconnecting with relationships built on honesty and mutual respect. Time spent with my grandmother strengthened our bond, her steady presence reminding me that care does not come with conditions. Conversations with close friends brought laughter back into my life, offering support without expectations. These connections reinforced what healthy relationships feel like, making the contrast with past dynamics impossible to ignore. With stability restored, I allowed myself to pursue a life that didn't revolve around constant exhaustion. A better job with balanced hours gave me something I had forgotten how to value: rest. Mornings no longer started with dread, and nights no longer ended in collapse. The physical relief mirrored emotional recovery, proving how closely the two were connected. Without the weight of exploitation, I had energy to imagine a future instead of just surviving the present. Finding peace did not mean forgetting what happened. It meant understanding it without letting it define me. The experience reshaped my understanding of loyalty, teaching me that boundaries are not punishments but necessities. Choosing distance was an act of self-respect, not cruelty. It allowed healing to begin without interference. In the quiet of my own home, peace arrived gradually, built through small, consistent choices rooted in self-worth. Cutting ties closed a painful chapter, but it also opened the door to a life guided by clarity, balance, and the freedom to protect what truly matters.